So Harry and Meghan just landed in Britain with Archie and Lilibet, and the reaction everyone was watching for was William's, because William's reaction to everything Harry related has been so consistent over the last several months. Firm, guarded, institutional, the man who builds frameworks and holds lines and refuses to let sentiment override structure. That's the William everyone has come to understand. And that's the William everyone expected to see when his brother landed in Britain with his family. What they got instead shocked everyone who witnessed it, because William's reaction wasn't what it had been before. Something had changed. And the thing that changed it was in the photographs right next to Harry and Meghan. It was the children, Archie and Lilibet, and William, seeing his niece and nephew on British soil for the first time in years, did something that surprised even the people closest to him. He let himself feel it. Before we go any further, two quick things. First, if you're new here, we're Crown Watch, and we break down the royal stories that actually matter. So hit subscribe. And second, if you want the details the mainstream coverage never touches, head to theroyalfiles.com. There's something on that site we don't talk about here on the channel, a hidden piece of royal history most people never find. The link is in the description. Okay, let's get into it. Here's what everyone was expecting. The palace had spent months building frameworks to govern exactly this moment. The institutional lines were clear. Harry's standing was defined, the conditions were set, the security arrangements were in place. The commercial restrictions were established. Everything was governed. And the expectation was that William, the man who had built most of those frameworks, would greet the news of Harry's landing with the same careful, controlled institutional equanimity he had brought to every previous development. A nod to the plan being executed, a quiet acknowledgement that the return had been managed correctly, perhaps some private relief that the frameworks were holding. Nothing warm, nothing unguarded, nothing that would give anyone outside the institution a different story to tell. Instead, William was reportedly moved, not performatively, not for the cameras, in the private moment among the people who know him, when the information came through that Harry and Meghan had landed with Archie and Lilibet. William's reaction carried something that the frameworks and the conditions and the institutional planning had not accounted for. It carried the uncle, the brother. The man who had known Harry his entire life, and who, whatever had happened between them, had never stopped being those things. And the children, specifically the children, were the thing that released it. Before we go further, real quick, if you're into deep dives on royal stories that actually sit with the complexity instead of just picking a side, hit subscribe and join us here at Crown Watch. We are building something good. Okay, back to it. Now here's why the children specifically were the thing that changed William's reaction. Because William has been thinking about this return for months as an institutional problem. A question of standing and access and conditions and precedent. And institutional problems produce institutional responses. You don't feel moved by an institutional problem. You manage it. But children are not an institutional problem. Children are just children. Archie and Lilibet had not left the institution. They had been born and raised elsewhere in a life that existed before they were old enough to make any choices about it. They had no standing to lose and no precedent to set and no conditions to satisfy. They were just kids, Harry's kids, William's niece and nephew. The children of the brother William grew up with, who share the grandmother who shaped both brothers, who will one day carry their own version of this family's complicated legacy. And when William held all of that in his mind at the same time, when the institutional framing briefly fell away and the human one took over, the reaction that came out was not the one the frameworks had prepared him for. That's the first twist, because William's reaction revealed something about how the last several months had affected him that nobody had quite seen before. He had been so focused on the institutional dimensions of the return, on protecting the palace's integrity, on ensuring the frameworks held, on preventing a return from becoming the restoration of standing that Harry wasn't entitled to, that he had been operating almost entirely in the institutional register. And the institutional register doesn't have much room for uncles. It has plenty of room for heirs and successors in policy positions and precedent-setting decisions. But uncles exist in a different register entirely, and Archie and Lilibet landing in Britain had pulled William into that register without asking permission. Children tend to do that to people who love them. Now here's the second twist, and it reveals what William actually did with the reaction. Because a warm reaction doesn't have to produce a dramatic gesture. It doesn't have to express itself through a public statement or a palace announcement, or any visible action at all. William's reaction expressed itself quietly, privately, through a series of small decisions that the people around him noticed, but that nobody outside the inner circle would have seen. He asked for updates on the family's whereabouts with more frequency than the institutional monitoring required. He made a point of personally reviewing the security arrangements to ensure they were adequate, rather than delegating that review the way he would normally have done. And he sent word through a private channel that if Harry wanted to see him, he was available, not through the institutional frameworks, through the back channel that brothers use when they want to talk without it becoming something official. That last gesture is the one that shocked people, because William sending word that he was available through a private channel, without conditions attached, without institutional framing, without any of the careful language that had governed every previous communication between the brothers, was so unlike the William of the last several months that the people who heard about it didn't quite believe it at first. The William who had built the frameworks and held the lines and said no to his own father when Charles had pushed for more flexibility was the same William who had just quietly opened a back channel door for his brother, not a palace door. Not an institutional door, a brother's door. Now here's the third twist, and it reveals why Archie and Lilibet specifically had this effect when Harry alone hadn't been enough. Because Harry's return as a concept had been abstracted into policy for William over the last several months. Every conversation about Harry had been a conversation about standing, about precedent, about the integrity of the frameworks. Harry had become a variable in an institutional equation rather than a brother in a relationship. And institutional variables don't pull on uncles. They generate analysis. But children, specific children with names and ages and personalities, cannot be abstracted into policy. And the knowledge that Archie and Lilibet were now in Britain, that they were here, physically in the country they come from, that they were the same ages as children William sees every day in his own home, closed the abstraction instantly. Harry became Harry again, the brother, not the policy question. That rehumanization is the thing that changed William's reaction. And it's the thing that raises the question nobody in the palace had thought to ask during all the months of framework building. What would it take to move William from institutional mode to human mode? Because William had been operating in institutional mode for so long and so effectively that everyone had begun to assume it was simply who he was. The man who built frameworks, the heir who held lines, the future king who chose structure over sentiment every time. And Archie and Lilibet had answered the question nobody had asked. What it took was children. His brother's children. The specific, concrete, undeniable human reality of two small people in an airport who share his blood and his family and his history. Catherine noticed the change in William and reportedly felt something shift in how she thought about the whole situation. Not because she was surprised exactly, but because she recognized something in William's reaction that she had been hoping to see for a long time, which was the moment when the institutional management of the Harry question became secondary to the human dimension of the family. Catherine had always understood that the frameworks were necessary. She had built many of them herself, but she had also always understood that frameworks are the floor, not the ceiling, that they exist to protect the minimum conditions for the family to function, not to replace the human connections that make a family worth protecting. And William's reaction to Archie and Lilibet's arrival suggested that he was beginning to understand the same thing, that the ceiling of what was possible between the brothers was not defined by any framework. It was defined by whether they chose to be brothers. Princess Anne's reaction to William's change was characteristically the most direct. She told him that the reaction was overdue, not unkindly, just factually the way Anne states things. He said that Harry's children had been paying the price of the brothers' estrangement in ways that nobody had been willing to say out loud. That growing up without access to their father's family, without the British part of their heritage, without the cousins and the uncles and the traditions that should have been theirs, was a cost that the institutional dispute had imposed on people who had no say in it. And Anne said that the framework building had been necessary, but that it had also unintentionally extended the cost to the children, and the cost to children should stop as quickly as it can be stopped. That was Anne, identifying the thing nobody had named, naming it plainly, and moving on. William heard her, and what he heard clarified something the warm reaction had started to show him, that the frameworks were supposed to serve the family, and the family included Archie and Lilibet, and a framework that was functioning well institutionally, but extending a cost to children who hadn't chosen any of this was a framework that needed to be adjusted, not in its institutional dimensions, but in how it affected the family's human dimensions. The conditions on Harry's standing could remain exactly as they were. The commercial restrictions could hold. The security arrangement was set. None of the institutional architecture needed to change. What needed to change was whether the framework was being used even unintentionally as a barrier to the children's connection to the family they came from. And if it was, that was something William could address without touching any of the institutional elements at all. He could simply make clear through the same private channel he had opened that whatever the framework said about Harry's standing, they said nothing that prevented Archie and Lilibet from being welcome, as family, as the children they were, as cousins to his own children who deserved to know each other. Charles's reaction to William's changed posture was the simplest of all the reactions. He was relieved, because Charles had been carrying the weight of the brothers' estrangement as a failure of his own fatherhood for years. He had watched two sons who had once been close become strangers, and he had not been able to fix it. And watching William's reaction to Archie and Lilibet, watching the institutional armor briefly lower because children had walked through the frame, Charles felt something he hadn't felt for a long time in relation to the two brothers. Hope, not certainty, not resolution, just the small, fragile, early version of hope that comes when you see the first genuine sign that something broken might eventually find its way to something healed. Now here comes the final twist. Because the thing William had sent through the back channel, the message that if Harry wanted to see him, he was available, reached Harry. And Harry's response, by the accounts available, was not an immediate yes. It was a pause. And the pause, which most people would read as hesitation, was actually something else. It was Harry processing the fact that the reaction he had expected from William, the institutional firmness, the maintained distance, the carefully managed non-engagement, was not what had arrived. Something warmer. And Harry, who had been bracing himself for the old William, the framework William, the policy question William, didn't quite know what to do with the new signal, because the new signal required a different response, and a different response required deciding whether to trust it, and deciding whether to trust it required deciding whether the change was real or whether it was just the children. Just a momentary softening that would harden again the moment the children were out of frame. That uncertainty, that inability to know whether the warmth would last, is the thing Harry is sitting with. And it's the thing that will determine whether William's shocked reaction is the beginning of something or just a crack in a wall that closes again. Nobody celebrated. William felt something human in a moment he'd been managing institutionally for months. Charles felt the first edge of hope. Catherine understood that the ceiling of what was possible had just been raised by two children who hadn't even tried. And Harry held a message from his brother and wasn't sure yet whether to believe it. That uncertainty, that fragile, unresolved, genuinely open question, is the most honest place this family has been in years. When the next chapter moves, you already know where to look for the parts nobody else will tell you. The next chapter of this family is still being written, and when it moves, we will be here to talk about it. If this video made you see any part of this story differently, drop your position in the comments. I read every one of them. And on a question this complicated, I genuinely want to know where you land. Subscribe if you are not already with us, because the next chapter is coming and it is going to be one worth watching. And here's the dimension Meghan was watching all of this from, because her experience of William's changed reaction was its own story. Meghan and William's relationship has been the most fraught of all the relationships this return has had to navigate. And Meghan, arriving in Britain, had braced herself for the formal William, the careful one who maintained institutional distance. What she heard instead, through Harry, was that William had sent word through a private channel, and her reaction was complicated, because a warm message is a beginning. It's not a resolution. It's not an acknowledgement of what happened before. It's just a door, slightly open, and Meghan, who had been through the institutional door before and found it led somewhere painful, wasn't sure yet whether the personal door led somewhere different. That uncertainty is real, and it's fair. The children, right in the middle of all of this, are living something entirely different from what any of the adults are experiencing. Archie and Lilibet don't know about frameworks or conditions or back channels. They know they're in a new place with their parents, and they will form their first real impressions of Britain in these days and weeks. From the people they meet and the warmth or coolness they encounter in the ordinary human moments that children notice and absorb even when adults think they aren't paying attention. The adults can manage the institutional story however they like. The children will absorb the human one, and what they absorb will shape how they feel about Britain for the rest of their lives. Which makes everything the family does in these early days a contribution to a story that won't be read for decades, but that is being written right now. William's warm reaction, if it extends to a warm welcome for the children, if Archie and Lilibet leave Britain feeling that the family they came to see was genuinely glad they came, will have done something no framework ever could. It will have given two children a reason to want to come back, and children who want to come back become adults who belong, and adults who belong are the foundation of a reconciliation that lasts. That's the long game, and it starts with an uncle who let himself feel something when his brother's children landed on British soil, not because the frameworks told him to, because he's an uncle, and some things are stronger than frameworks. And what about the country watching all of this? Because Britain has been watching this return the way Britain watches everything royal, with a complicated mixture of skepticism and hope, of the inherited wariness toward Harry and Meghan that years of headlines have produced, and the older, warmer feeling toward the idea of a family healing itself. And William's reaction, if it becomes known in any form, will change how the country reads the story, because the country's narrative about William and Harry has been one of permanent, unbridgeable estrangement. Two brothers, two camps, no middle ground. And a warm reaction from William, specifically a warm reaction triggered by children, is the kind of thing that cuts through the hardened narrative because it's so human. Nobody can be cynical about an uncle softening because his niece and nephew arrived. Nobody can make that political. It just is what it is. A man, briefly, being more uncle than heir. And the country, which despite everything still wants this family to be whole, would receive that quietly and without fanfare, the way it always receives the moments that feel genuinely true. There's also the question of what Archie and Lilibet themselves carry away from this, not the politics, not the frameworks, not even the warm signal William sent through the back channel, just the experience of being here, the smell of the air, the sound of the country, the faces of people who knew their father when he was a child. Children collect these impressions the way they collect everything, unconsciously, completely, permanently. And if the impressions they collect in these first days are warm, if they feel the country opening to them rather than holding them at arm's length, they will carry that warmth with them back to California and forward into adulthood. And one day, when they're old enough to understand the story their parents lived through, they will have their own memories of Britain to set against it, their own evidence that the country their father came from had a place for them too. That will matter more than any institutional arrangement, more than any framework or condition or commercial restriction. The memory of being welcomed is the foundation of belonging. And belonging, built one visit at a time, one warm reception at a time, is what makes a return permanent. William's reaction shocked everyone, because they expected the institutional William and got the uncle. And the uncle, it turns out, was the most important person in the room. So here's where I hand it to you. Was William's warm reaction genuine, a real shift in how he relates to his brother now that the children are present? Or is it a temporary softening that will harden again when the day-to-day institutional realities reassert themselves? Does the back-channel message he sent represent the beginning of a real reconciliation between the brothers, or just a small human moment that doesn't change the larger picture? And does the fact that it took the children, specifically Archie and Lilibet, to move William past the institutional mode, tell you something important about what finally changes people? Not arguments. Not frameworks. Not carefully constructed institutional logic. Children. Two small people who landed on British soil and reminded an uncle that he is an uncle. There is no clean answer, and anyone who hands you one quickly hasn't sat with the full weight of it. William's reaction shocked everyone. The frameworks are still there, the conditions still hold, the institutional architecture is intact, and somewhere in Britain tonight, two children are asleep who came from a place they've never lived in and may one day call home. And the uncle who made room for them, quietly, through a private channel, in a moment nobody was supposed to see, may have done more for this family's future than any framework ever built. When the next chapter moves, you already know where to look for the parts nobody else will tell you. The next chapter of this family is still being written, and when it moves, we will be here to talk about it. If this video made you see any part of this story differently, drop your position in the comments. I read every one of them. And on a question this complicated, I genuinely want to know where you land. Subscribe if you are not already with us, because the next chapter is coming, and it is going to be one worth watching.